I've been a devoted fan of The Legend of Zelda since I was a child, enjoying its numerous adventures countless times since then. And in all that time, I've seen the games become the subject of equally countless and tiresome debates amongst the fanbase. They seemingly go through a cycle of widespread praise, only to be cast down just a couple of years later based on… well, I'm not even sure, to be honest. It's a total enigma and has only caused me increasing amounts of consternation with each debate. And yet there's one title that, to my observations, has befallen an increasing amount of derision in recent years beyond this bizarre rotation between approval and disapproval. This strangeness comes partially from the strong acclaim Twilight Princess garnered around its release. I keenly remember the rhetoric being spouted across publications, with numerous 9 and 10 out of 10 scores and cries of, "Yes, finally! Ocarina of Time has been usurped from its throne." Okay, pretty sure that exact phrasing is just me, but you get the idea. Most everyone was hooked upon that first venture into a new-look Hyrule, and I was firmly amongst that crowd. Yet we're now a few months into 2016 with an HD remake gracing our presence, and it just feels like no one really cares about this game, and I can't wrap my head around why. While I don't know that any game in a series as celebrated as The Legend of Zelda necessarily requires any defending, I still really love Twilight Princess and kinda feel like it's one of the underrated gems of the series, so I simply want to shine some light on why I love it so much. Zelda games have always been rather interesting in that despite continually having many similarities across them, they all have their own vibe from the start. In particular, I've come to enjoy and appreciate the beginnings to Link's adventures more and more, as he continues to have just a bit more humble of origins, allowing him to really grow into the role we all know he'll fulfill. In Twilight Princess, it's quite endearing in a way that Link starts out as a local farmhand, helping his fellow Ordonians with menial tasks and being the role model for all the younger people in the village. While it certainly doesn't excuse the length of the game's introduction and its heavy-handed tutorials, a segment that has already been rightly criticized to great effect by others, thematically they make a lot of sense when you consider Link's position within his hometown. You're essentially the cool older sibling, so of course a bunch of rambunctious children are going to ask to see a sword or slingshot in action. Granted, the way the slingshot is handled is, well, kind of bad, but obvious as it may be, I still very much like the setup that Link is a nobody destined for greatness. To me, this is one of the more powerful themes found throughout the series. Growth. It manifested itself nicely in Ocarina of Time, where a young Link is thrust headlong into the perils of Hyrule and is forced to grow up quicker than any child should have to. Similarly, Twilight Princess tackles this in its own way, forcing adversity upon Link in several ways, not least of which is your ill-fated transformation into a wolf. When you add Midna to the growing problems and responsibilities upon your back, it becomes a real test for Link to summon up some courage and save the world, especially seeing as he has the Queen of Snark hounding him all the way to the finale. While this is punctuated by the mechanics in this form, with a severely limited moveset deliberately forcing a refreshing change of pace upon the player, the introduction of Midna remains a potent memory 10 years on from my first playthrough. Despite her potentially being an irritating companion with her sardonic comments and bristly attitude, it's compelling to see her growth throughout her adventure alongside Link. She gradually opens up to him more and more as you progress, with the desperate trek to save her from death while temporarily return to your wolf form a clear turning point and highlight of the relationship between the two. By the end of the game, she's attempting to sacrifice herself to help right the wrongs that led to the world succumbing to Twilight. And at the outset of your adventure, there's no way she would have given any action like that any thought. There's then a genuine sadness when she survives, revealing her true form, but must then say goodbye for good after the dust settles, as there's this connection you forged that's unlike any other game in the series. While Link's growth is somewhat exhibited through the player, Midna's is laid bare as a result of the action you add to Link. And to put it simply, it feels great to create that bond along the way and come to see how she changes because of you. But if we return to Link, perhaps my favorite aspect of Twilight Princess is how I relate it back to my favorite fantasy novels. Many of these books contain detailed maps within their inner pages, highlighting character routes through many miles of dangerous lands. In the greatest tales, there's a real sense of purpose and adventure as the party sets out on their travels, with a grand set of obstacles in their path. path. And when they finally reach their goal, there's such a level of accomplishment about it all. While the struggle might have been great, they really worked for it and reached their destination, and it feels like they're better earning the right to assume a role greater than themselves. It's then accentuated further when you can look at a map with the names of the places they visited and envision it all to great detail. The scale of it all was always staggering to me, and I love how even a simple map can allow the reader to impart a bit of their own imagination into what they've read. I then love the sheer scale of Twilight Princess and how there's continually larger treks to get where we need to go. More than any Zelda game before, there's such a sense of achievement when you brave the perilous storms of Snow Peak, ascending the mountain through dense snow and frost-ridden caves, before taking a tumble down the backside only to find a beautiful mansion far from society. More than ever, I truly felt like I was assuming the role of the hero and overcoming the tribulations placed in front of me. It felt like a grand adventure. The Hyrule we see might be far larger than any incarnation before it, but the grandeur of it all translated so well to the journey at hand. The size of Hyrule and your travels across it then remind me of the novels I reveled in years ago, and that's a fondness that makes an oft-criticized aspect of Twilight Princess incredibly enjoyable and memorable to me. Visually, we're looking at a game that deliberately went in a different direction from its predecessors, especially when compared to its immediate 3D sibling, the Wind Waker. Bright cell shading and expressiveness is replaced with a far more brooding color palette and an unsaturated quality that, again, conjures up images of all the fantasy novels I read throughout my childhood. While this shift in looks was and still is a turnoff for some, Twilight Princess is borderline my favorite looking 3D Zelda. At times I've had a difficult time deciphering what exactly it is I like so much about the visual stylings of Twilight Princess, but if I had to say any one thing, I'd say it revolves around how mysterious much of Hyrule feels based on the visual choices that were made. Twilight Princess's version of this fabled land feels weathered and ancient, and the further you travel into its recesses, the more hallowed and interesting it gets. And despite many a voice decrying the game for trying to be too similar to Majora's Mask or Ocarina, Twilight Princess's areas never felt as depressing or whimsical as either of those gems. I've always felt that analysis in particular just didn't really sit right with me. Simply in the fact that, although comparisons between the games can certainly be made, this one just didn't feel fair to any of them. I don't think we're really able to surmise the intentions of the dev team in that way, and it ultimately feels like an excuse to denigrate a title when there's plenty of other stuff more worthy of criticizing. Twilight Princess was attempting to be bleak in some ways, but it never felt like a poor attempt at being like Ocarina or Majora. Some lackluster cutscenes aside, it felt like the most cinematic Zelda title yet, and I absolutely love that about it. However, in entertaining the comparisons, it's a bit odd to say given the game's plot. Hyrule is a land that's continually being robbed of its glow, and even when you've restored a section to its rightful state, there's still dim lighting. There's more so a we don't really know what's going to happen type of gloom hanging around the world of Hyrule, whereas Termina's gloom is more of a it's hanging right over our heads, literally, and there's nothing we can do. Or, to put it differently, the stylings of Twilight Princess help to accentuate the mysterious qualities I feel it has, and only make me want to explore it further. This idea relates to specific set pieces. An old ice-shrouded mansion hanging above a far-away precipice or an ancient civilization floating far above only entice me to explore their confines based on their premise alone. For example, let's focus in on the game's third dungeon, the Lakebed Temple. Firstly, it's situated at the bottom of Lake Hylia, which is already a deservedly more grand set piece compared to previous incarnations. It feels as large as a lake of this importance should, and so diving far below to reach a temple already feels a lot better when compared to Ocarina's similar setup. That isn't even meant to disparage it either. At some point, your age just catches up to you. In breaking into the temple, we immediately swim through a long, winding tunnel, sharing its space with both deadly and not so deadly aquatic life in the form of jellyfish and algae, and it feels quite natural to have these touches in place. Before long, we're exploring cavernous openings, complete with massive stalactites, touches of mist, and running water dripping through cracks and over outcroppings. And again, nothing here feels strange. even when we begin to encounter more structures and bits of technology carved out of the rock. More than ever, a temple in a Zelda game not only felt adequately large so as to provide a challenge, but thematically sound. From little ambient touches to the architecture of the temple, everything here is so on point. I believe the Zoras built and once inhabited this place, and that everything has stopped flowing properly because of the monsters that made it their home. Twilight Princess's search for realism is reflected well throughout, allowing me to get totally immersed in exploring and conquering this sprawling cave network deep within the bedrock of an ancient lake. In other words, it's not just the colors that were used, but how all the stylistic changes improve the various settings you visit along your travels. When you combine these locations with a more bleak-looking art style, it only serves to enhance the game's theming even more so. And I think it's a case of Nintendo yet again understanding these choices so well and making another great Zelda experience as a result. More than any other Zelda game, Twilight Princess is the title that's given me the strongest desire to reach the waypoints on my map beyond a need to do it for progression's sake or for some kind of divine calling. I simply wanted to go there for myself. For the first time in a 3D Zelda title, fabled video game composer Koji Kondo was not the person behind the game's tracks. Taking on the role of sound supervisor instead, the role of composer fell to Toru Minegishi and Asuka Ota. Normally, I think there'd be some level of apprehension at not having Koji Kondo be the one doing the composing, but luckily Twilight Princess's soundtrack is just as memorable and exciting as anything else in the series. And it has its own vibe, ranging from delightful acoustic guitar accompanied by moving bass and strings, to strange electronic and almost glitch-laced sounds during battles in the Twilight Realms. I find the soundtrack to be quite interesting and strange, but it matches well with the at times austere and overall enchanting combination of landscapes and moments in the game. Midna's Desperate Hour is a highly celebrated point, due in no small part to the accompanying musical journey present, with its pensive piano stepping alongside a ceaseless, somber rainstorm. The combination sets the mood so wonderfully, so it's no surprise that people everywhere continue to sing its praises. Allowing the song to flow uninterrupted by the interjection of battle music is the only way this juncture could have been more impactful. However, while it's absolutely revered in Ocarina of Time, and for good reason, the first moments entering Hyrule Field in Twilight Princess is a pivotal moment in the still early moments of the game, and is a scene that, much like the rest of the game, I feel is in some ways quite underrated. And it's not so much that it does anything particularly revolutionary. It's very much reminiscent of that early scene from my favorite game of all time. However, that doesn't make it any less grand, and that initial orchestral flourish is a bold step towards exploring this bigger, badder version of Hyrule, and it will never cease to make my hair stand on end. That being said, the Hyrule Field theme heard here is unlike most of the songs in the game. And while that makes it stand out nicely, it's the subdued melancholy of so many of the songs that make me adore the soundtrack so highly. Now, one of my favorite mini-bosses in the entire series is the Skull Kid fight that takes place in the Sacred Grove. And while the encounter itself is quite memorable, upon further reflection, I think the tune that plays within these enchanted woods adds so much to the moment. As you move along trying to track down the Skull Kid in a mostly harmless game of hide and seek, a more thoughtful version of Ocarina's Lost Woods theme hovers in and out, with a wistful harp continually guiding it along. This slower, somber version of a once jovial and nostalgic tune helps to add to the mystery and wonder that permeates through the Sacred Grove, and this lines up so sincerely with the implied motivations of the Skull Kid. In provoking your attacks with puppets, he's actually slowly guiding you to where you need to go, and in never directly going on the offensive, he leaves himself open to being hit, merely wanting to play with you. Once he leaves, he giggles impishly and hopes you'll be back to hang out with him again. There's a playfulness about him that's reflected in the main melody so many know and love, but there's always that tinge of reflection and sadness buried in the overlying harp, almost as if he knows something Link, and by proxy we, the player, do not. It's these layers to music that can add so much to a cutscene or fight or even simple exploration, and this brilliant track is one that's only gotten better upon repeat listenings. And so many of the songs in the game capture these sentiments. Again, the mystery of Twilight Princess's version of Hyrule has been a near-endless source of wonderment for me, and the music in every single spot only serves to enhance those feelings. Mechanically, Twilight Princess is one of the most interesting titles in the franchise, with its pointer controls a surprisingly functional and enjoyable aspect of the experience. Firing a boat is always fun, but it's never been better than in this game, with picking off enemies from distance particularly satisfying. And despite some understandable gripes with how weapon importance is handled throughout your journey, the added functionality of some classic items makes for a refreshing change of pace compared to its siblings. The Gale Boomerang adds in gust abilities, becoming this game's version of the Magical Leaf, only now with added range thanks to the ability to aim it all around at several targets. Meanwhile, the Ball and Chain acts as a renewed version of the hammer from previous titles, complete with a hefty sense of weight, only, again, with added range and a greater amount of utility in battle. There's also better flow and conveyance overall, with the revamped weapon menu's ease of use removing previous nightmares of popping in and out for our favorite iron boots in years past. There's no reason a series like Zelda can't and shouldn't become more streamlined through choices like these, so it's all the better that Nintendo has recognized this and made correct steps over the years. And again, while it isn't a big deal considering Ocarina's age, I greatly enjoy the revamped Zora tunic found in Twilight Princess. You just pop it on like normal and it gives you total freedom of movement in the water, and complete with a look that actually makes sense as opposed to a simple palette swap. It's really simple in the grand scheme of things, but these details are what help to elevate games a step at a time, so these additions and changes only make me happier as a fan. What makes me the happiest though are the game's dungeons, of which I think are the best amongst the 3D titles. Every single dungeon has just enough linearity so as to not be overly complicated, but just the right amount of diverse puzzles, making each new dungeon increasingly difficult as you progress. And they all utilize their respective weapons fairly well, fitting that familiar Zelda mold for dungeon progression, while also bringing the added level of creativity the weapons provide. The Temple of Time is a highlight in this regard, not only capturing a lot of that mystery that I find so intriguing, but also being very well realized in its structure. We've seen plenty of dungeons that revolve around a tower, where progression is hinged on how you ascend. The Temple of Time spins this on its head by first having you make your way to the top, only to then change the challenges around as you make your way back down to the entrance. This is centered around the acquiring of the Dominion Rod, which is a vastly improved version of the command melody found in the Wind Waker. You just fire away using the rod and you've possessed a nearby statue within seconds, making a large amount of switching back and forth significantly less tedious. So, you've not only got a weapon bringing a means of progression back in a streamlined manner, but you're forced to think differently between the portions of the temple. The initial section gives you a tougher route as you gain an understanding of your path up, before the long return to the entrance tests your ability to move a powerful yet ultimately large statue through the same tests. The Temple of Time forces you to think on your feet and has a nice balance of item usage, puzzles, and combat, making it a highlight amongst a great set of dungeons. I come away from Twilight Princess yet again feeling like it doesn't deserve the disrespect it gets, which isn't to say it doesn't have some problems, because it does have a few glaring ones. Lengthy, padded out, over-tutorialized introduction aside, the wolf form doesn't see enough of use throughout the game, nor does it provide enough utility in its usage despite the fact that it's a great addition. And again, the sections where you must collect the Tears of Light, even with the delightful bloom effects of the Twilight Realm, are tedious, and merely come across as additional padding. While a game is the sum of its parts, it's also a lot more than that, and the personal connections I've forged with this game over the years will always outweigh its flaws. My early high school life was met with the next big Zelda adventure, pairing my continual growth into adulthood with a blooming, enveloping Twilight. This game will always occupy a compartment in the cabinet space inside my head, and for that, I am grateful.